Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Getty Villa. I'm Sarah Cole, Assistant Curator of Antiquities here at the Villa, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to today's program, which is related to our current special exhibition, Nubia, Jewels of Ancient Sudan from the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. So I will begin today by giving a brief overview of our current exhibition. Nubia, Jewels of Ancient Sudan, is on view here at the Villa on the second floor of the museum through April 3rd, 2023. The exhibition features items of jewelry and personal adornment worn by royalty and aristocrats in ancient Nubia's Kingdom of Kush. And on the map in this photo, you can see that Nubia is a region that covered part of what is today southern Egypt and northern Sudan. All of the objects in the exhibition were excavated in the early 20th century by the joint Harvard-Boston Museum of Fine Arts expedition to Sudan, and they were primarily found in wealthy tombs. As a result of these excavations, the MFA Boston has the largest and most significant collection of Nubian material outside of Sudan. The exhibition covers approximately 3,000 years of ancient history, beginning with the rise of the Kingdom of Kush at the city of Kerma in present-day Sudan, around 2400 BC. Jewelry from Kerma reflects the use of organic materials like shell and ivory, the development of faience production in Nubia, which is a bright blue glazed ceramic, and the skilled craftsmanship used to work with materials like gold, quartz, and semi-precious stones like cornelian and amethyst. This period came to an end around 1500 BC after flourishing for almost 1,000 years when Egypt invaded and seized control of Nubia. Several hundred years later, when the Egyptians withdrew from Nubia, the Kingdom of Kush reasserted itself, this time at a new capital city called Napatan, around 750 BC. And it was during this period that the Nubians invaded Egypt and ruled there for about 80 years as the 25th dynasty. Then, after being driven out of Egypt, the kings of Napatan continued to rule the Kingdom of Kush. During this time, we see an influx of Egyptian influences in the jewelry and self-presentation of Nubian royalty. Many exquisite items of personal adornment were created in the Napatan period, and most of the objects in this gallery come from the tombs of kings and queens. In the later Napatan period, the administrative center of the Kingdom of Kush began to move further south to a city called Meroitic. And by around 350 BC, the royal cemetery had moved there as well, beginning what we call the Meroitic period, the final phase of the Kingdom of Kush. And this period corresponded with the conquests of Alexander the Great, which included Egypt, and then the rise of the Roman Empire. The Kingdom of Kush maintained its independence throughout this time, but had connections to Greco-Roman trade networks. And so we start to see some Greek and Roman influences coming into Nubian jewelry, but still with a very distinctive local character. At Meroe, artists were exceptionally skilled at gold working, and they also employed many enameling techniques using powdered glass applied to the surfaces of items of jewelry to create rich, colorful patterns. And this period came to an end around AD 350, which is where the exhibition concludes. So now I would like to hand it over to Dr. Suzanne Gensica, who is the Senior Conservator of Antiquities here at the Getty Villa, to introduce today's speaker.
Good afternoon and welcome. I'm happy you all chose to come to our dark lecture room on this beautiful sunny day. As Sarah said, my name is Suzanne Gensica, and it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Denise Doxey. Denise is curator of ancient Egyptian, Nubian, and Near Eastern art at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, where she has been employed since 1999. Denise received her MA in archaeology from Oxford University and her PhD in ancient history from the University of Pennsylvania. Prior to her engagement at the MFA, she was keeper of collections in the Egyptian section at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, as well as an adjunct assistant professor of Egyptology at the University of Pennsylvania. She has also taught Egyptology courses at Harvard University and has participated in excavations at Abydos and Saqqara in Egypt. She's currently vice president of the Board of Governors of the American Research Center in Egypt. Among her many achievements, she co-curated Secrets of Tomb 10A, Egypt 2000 BC, also from the Harvard University Museum of Fine Arts expedition, a tomb that was excavated in Middle Egypt at Deir el-Bersha. She was recently, or in recent years, has been the lead curator of various versions of exhibitions on ancient Nubia, one entitled Ancient Nubia Now at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston in 2019, which also traveled nationally and internationally, and of which you see, as Sarah pointed out, an abbreviated and most precious version here at the Getty Villa. Denise has published widely on Egyptian art, history, and religion. She has authored several books, and two of them in particular are of interest for us today. Jewels of Ancient Nubia, which she co-authored with Yvonne Markowitz, and MFA Highlights, Arts of Ancient Nubia. And here's a shameless plug, they're both available in the gift shop across. I have had the great fortune of working with Denise at the MFA for many years on exhibitions and special projects. I value her very much as a scholar, colleague, and friend. She knows this material better than anyone else and harbors a deep love for the mysterious ancient material culture. She will also know probably the whereabouts of thousands of these items in the museum's cavernous storage rooms. And she provides the open sesame to its collections, as she will open the doors to Nubian history and its unique jewelry for you today in her lecture entitled The Hidden Meanings of Ancient Nubian Jewelry. So please join me in welcoming Denise warmly. She has traveled to us from a sub-zero climate on Friday. Denise.
Well, thank you for that very kind introduction, and thank you to the staff of the Getty Villa for the opportunity to speak with you today, and thanks to all of you for sharing part of this beautiful Sunday afternoon with me. Now, it's always a treat to come to the Getty Villa, which is a truly magical place, but as Suzanne mentioned, it is especially a treat to come to the Getty Villa when the low temperature in Boston this weekend was -14. Now, you might have to forgive me a little bit for the title of this, because when you see the title, The Hidden Meanings of Ancient Nubian Jewelry, you could easily be forgiven for thinking that I'm actually going to explain what those hidden meanings are. Unfortunately, none of us can go back in time and put ourselves in the minds of someone who was living in northeastern Africa 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000 years ago. So the best we can do is speculate about what this material meant to the artists who made it and the patrons who wore it. So what I'm going to do today is attempt to show how the archaeological and historical record might help to inform us as to what this jewelry meant to those who lived in ancient times. Before I start, though, I would like to give you a little background and also give credit where credit is due, is that this project would not have taken place without the inspiration of Yvonne Markowitz, who Suzanne mentioned, who was our curator of jewelry of all periods and has an encyclopedic knowledge of jewelry. But back about a decade ago, she approached me to ask if I would be willing to work on an exhibition of ancient Nubian jewelry, which became in 2014 a much smaller version of this show that was shown in Boston. And I learned so much from Yvonne that if this was a book, she'd be footnoted on every page. So thanks to Yvonne for much of what you're going to be hearing. To put Nubia on the map, I think Sarah has already done so. We're talking about the area from the southernmost part of Egypt through the northern part of Sudan. Everything you see today is going to be from Sudan. And this is an area which seems very remote today, but was actually quite a cosmopolitan happening place in ancient times. But the economy of Nubia, I think, really influences what we see in the jewelry of Nubia, because it's not a great area for agriculture. So one of the driving economic forces in ancient Nubia was the raising and husbandry of animals, notably cattle and sheep, or cattle and goats. So when you see the Nubian jewelry, I think you'll see the significance of some of these creatures. In addition to that, the major centers of ancient Nubia were located at places where trade routes from throughout Central and Northern Africa came together at the Nile, which made the Nubians the ideal trade middlemen, if you will, from Africa via the Nile Valley to the Mediterranean and beyond. And here you see a group of Nubians at the time of the King Tutankhamun coming to his court with some of these exotic materials. And I draw your attention to the man in the middle who looks like he's carrying a tray of donuts or bagels. Those were actually gold ingots. And gold was the single most important export item and natural resource of ancient Nubia throughout its history. To give you one example of the importance of gold in ancient Nubia, I show you this object, which is a naturally occurring alluvial gold nugget, the kind that you would find panning for gold in a river, much like took place here in California back in 1849. But this is an exceptionally huge example of one of these. It's 50 grams of gold. And it has not been worked into any kind of a shape other than the addition of this cylindrical gold bale at the top, which would enable it to be worn as a necklace. So it seems that gold, in addition to its economic value, also had a symbolic value, as it did in many ancient cultures, probably because of the fact that it does not decay. So how did this material come to be in Boston? And Sarah has also explained this to some extent, that for about 30 years in the early 20th century, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston paired with Harvard University on a series of excavations in both Egypt and Sudan. George Andrew Reisner was the leader of these projects. He was both a curator at the MFA and a professor at Harvard, and he was really one of the founding fathers of scientific archaeology in the United States. He was a meticulous record keeper. He was one of the first people to really pioneer the use of photography. And it's really because of his meticulous records that we can actually even explain what some of this jewelry, how it was used. He was accompanied by a very skillful Egyptian archaeologist, Said Ahmed Said, who was in charge of the day-to-day operations of the site, the various sites, and Dawes Dunham, who at that point was a young assistant, but went on to succeed Reisner as curator and was the person who ultimately published most of this material. That said, Reisner was a product of his day. He was born only 2 years after the Civil War, and some of his social and political attitudes seem sort of revolting by today's standards. Some of his interpretations were wildly racist and sexist by today's standards. And interestingly enough, and ironically in a way, it is his fantastic record keeping that has enabled scholars in recent years to disprove some of his theories. So in addition to being a very skillful archaeologist, he was also a very lucky archaeologist, because back in the days when he was excavating, the policy in both Egypt and Sudan was to share the finds of expeditions with the institutions that financed them. And he was fortunate enough in being given permission to excavate the royal cemeteries at the three principal sites that cover the multi-thousand-year history of ancient Nubia, as Sarah mentioned, Kerma, Napatan, and Meroitic. So to begin with Kerma, here on the left-hand side, you see an excavation photo taken of one of the last and largest royal burials. Kerma burials took the form of these mud brick mounds that were later filled in with sand. And this one is really enormous. The diameter of this tumulus is roughly the size of the length of a football field. So they're enormous buildings. And in the background, you see a mortuary building that was associated with it, which you see a contemporary picture of that on the right. And while this looks like a sort of monotonous beige blob right now, in antiquity, it was decorated with ornate blue faience, shiny glazed animals, and other stylistic elements, including a pair of lions flanking the main entrance. The reason I bring this up is because, interestingly, the ancient Kerma people not only left no written records, but they left no representations of kings or queens or gods or goddesses in human form. So we are left with the archaeological record to explain anything we know about their religion. And it seems that animals, not surprisingly for a pastoral economy, played a major role in their religious beliefs, possibly lions, the king of the jungle, even now a symbol of royal power. And we see similar animals on all forms of objects from ancient Kerma, lions and rams being particularly prominent, but also hippopotamuses, bulls, other powerful creatures that inhabited the Nile Valley at that time. I show you this object, which is probably the earliest object in the exhibition, not because it's particularly mysterious. Well, it would be mysterious were it not for the fact that we have the excavation records and photos. Because if you saw this object just by itself, you probably would have no idea what it was. But the excavation records show that these were found in groups, or pairs or groups, around the head of the deceased person. And what they actually are hair ornaments, so that the hair could be pulled up that slit, and when it got to the hole in the center, it would be held in place. So these are sort of early 3rd millennium ponytail holders. Absolutely unique to Kerma, at least to my knowledge, are these glazed quartz beads. And quartzite are both very abundant in this part of Sudan. But what the ancient Nubians did was to coat them with a glaze that was clear when applied, but when fired at a high temperature formed this beautiful translucent blue. And this blue seems to have been a significant color, just as we saw with the lions and other decorations from the mortuary temple, because in order to achieve this glaze, you have to use a very high temperature, which then runs the risk of cracking the quartz. So it's a very difficult technique, particularly when you don't have an adequate control over the temperature of the fire. But they mastered this and produced them by the thousands. And I think the blue may very well have a solar connotation, or possibly the life-giving waters of the Nile, which brought the annual floods that enabled agriculture as well as transportation. Along with glazing beads that were man-made, they also glazed naturally occurring crystals. And these seem to have had some sort of a protective function. They were worn on belts or on necklaces, and they always strike me as a little bit new agey, like something you'd find in Sedona. But and this is another case where the archaeological record kind of comes in handy, because when we had this exhibition in Boston, we mounted and displayed this as a necklace, published it as a necklace. But looking over some of the excavation records not long ago, I realized it was actually found near the waist of the deceased, which we know is the case of many of these. So this may in fact be a belt rather than a necklace. Live and learn. Sometimes the meaning of an amulet or a piece of jewelry changed when it crossed the border. Egypt and Nubia were constantly interacting with one another throughout their histories, after all, their next-door neighbors. And here we have two objects of Egyptian origin that were incorporated into otherwise Nubian pieces of jewelry. So on the left is an Egyptian scarab, which has been mounted in gold and set into a bracelet. And unfortunately, I haven't got a picture of the flip side of this, but it shows an Egyptian official, a male Egyptian official wearing a long skirt, which is typical of male Egyptian officials. But this was not found in the tomb of a Nubian man, but in the tomb of a Nubian woman. And in fact, it was women who wore those long skirts in Nubia. And this is not only a woman's tomb, but an enormously well-appointed woman's tomb. The woman was wearing an elaborate silver headdress. She had sacrificial victims with her. She very heavily adorned, and clearly someone of great importance, although without written records we don't know who. The necklace on the right-hand side you hopefully recognize the glazed quartz beads, which are local, but the silver cylindrical bead in the center is an Egyptian import. Now, this is sort of the reverse of the other bracelet, because these amulets are worn in Egypt by women and may have had some sort of a fertility connotation. But this necklace was actually found on a male tomb, in a male tomb of a very heavily armed warrior. So clearly he was not worried about his childbearing abilities, and this may very well have been a souvenir of battle, because at this period in Nubian history, the Kerma people reached the sort of the greatest height of their power, they became a real threat to Egypt. They were launching attacks into southern Egypt. And contrary to Reisner's belief that they were always inferior to the Egyptians, they were in fact a very formidable enemy. Unfortunately for them, eventually a new, very powerful dynasty emerged in Egypt around 1550 BC, and the Egyptians, as Sarah mentioned, came south and destroyed Kerma and took over its territory and ruled over Nubia for about 500 years. So not unusually, this was a period of great cross-cultural intercommunication and entanglement. It was not people sometimes call it a period of Egyptian colonization, which is not accurate because the Egyptians did not wholesale send settlers into Nubia. But they did erect a number of fortresses and garrisons and temples, including the temple that you see here on the left at Soleb, and a temple which is no longer visible because it's under later material at the site of Jebel Barkal, which is the capital that we know as Napata. And Napata had been a sacred site since early in Nubian history, but the Egyptians associated it with their principal god, Amun. And so it became a temple of Amun in the period of Egyptian occupation. And the Nubians adopted Amun wholesale into their own pantheon. He became the lead god of ancient Kush. And people often think that this is kind of a one-way influence with ideas coming from Egypt into Sudan. But in fact, many of these influences went both directions. And in Nubia, Amun was obviously associated with one of these earlier ram gods that goes back to Kerma or even earlier. Because in Nubia, Amun invariably takes the form of either a ram-headed man or a ram. And this image of Amun in ram form was later transmitted into Egypt, so that we see on this rather humble stele in the MFA's collection a representation of a sphinx with the head of a ram, and this grand sphinx colonnade or a processional way at the temple of Amun at Karnak shows Amun not in his traditional Egyptian form, but in the form that was introduced from Nubia. It's kind of a fun fact, not really related to the exhibition, but another jewelry-related process that took place during this time was the introduction into Egypt of earrings. Prior to their interaction with Nubia, we never see earrings on people. And after this time, they become ubiquitous, as here in the tomb of Nefertari at Thebes. There's not a lot in the show from this period of Egyptian occupation, but this is one of the most important pieces. It's called a menat, which originally functioned as the counterweight or counterpoise to a broad, heavy collar, beaded collar, so to kind of keep it from digging into the back of your neck. But they ultimately became amulets associated with the goddess Hathor, an Egyptian goddess of love and beauty and fertility, who was, like Amun, welcomed wholeheartedly into the Nubian pantheon. And here, too, I think the animal associations have something to do with it, because Hathor can be shown as a woman with the horns of a cow and a solar disk on her head. She can be shown as a woman with the ears of a cow, or, as in the bottom example here, in completely cow form. And Hathor becomes one of the most ubiquitous Egyptian deities who will be seen throughout the rest of Nubian jewelry manufacture. You'll notice the shape of this amulet copies that of the menats, and these became incredibly popular with Nubian queens and royal women in the years that followed. So eventually, Egypt's power waned, its economic power began to fraction, the political state fractured, and we have some kings coming in from Libya, of various local kings claiming the throne of Egypt. But the southern Egyptians, the great sanctuaries of Amun at Karnak, remained incredibly close through this time to the priesthood of Amun at Jebel Barkal. And here you see one of the Nubian temples that replaced the Egyptian temples at Jebel Barkal. So when the southern Egyptians were threatened by some of their northern neighbors, they turned not to other Egyptians, but to the Napatan kings in Jebel Barkal, who under a king by the name of Pianki in the 8th century BC not only protected and defended his southern Egyptian allies, but went ahead northward and conquered the entire Nile Valley up to the Mediterranean. And while he came back to Nubia after his conquest, 4 of his immediate successors actually ruled from Egypt, lived in Egypt, and they formed what is known as the 25th dynasty in Egypt. Reisner excavated at the temple of Jebel Barkal, but also at the 2 royal cemeteries adjacent to Jebel Barkal from the Napatan kings, the earlier one at Kuru and later one at Nuri. This statue actually comes from the temple at Jebel Barkal, and it shows the king Taharka. It's a relatively humble-looking object, but Taharka was actually the king of Nubia at the height of its greatest extent. He unfortunately went so far as to attack the Assyrians, and later his successors came to regret that. But the jewelry that he is wearing shows the royal regalia of Nubian kings. They wore these sort of tight-fitting caps with not one cobra, as is typical of Egyptian kings, but 2, symbolizing their authority over both Egypt and Nubia, and a heavy chain around his neck that has an image of the ram's head of Amun in the center and 2 smaller ones at the ends, and also, while they're not very clear on the slide, earrings in the form of ram's heads. And we have in the exhibition one earring. This is not from the tomb of Taharka, but of one of his successors, and it shows what the double uraeus cobra and sun disk on the head of Amun. We also have this ring that is from the tomb of Taharka, which is, it strikes me as a very contemporary looking ring that you could see someone wearing today. Some of the most spectacular objects in the exhibition come from the tombs of the wives, daughters, and other royal women of the time of Pianki, including this Sphinx, which is in many ways very Egyptian in appearance. And a lot of this jewelry from this time period, it's almost impossible to distinguish whether it was made in Egypt or made in Nubia. But in any case, I think it reflects the aesthetic and the religious beliefs of the Nubians. So for all intents and purposes, I'll call it Nubian. This shows a ram-headed sphinx, yet again, seated on a column. The column has very Egyptian color scheme. But the sphinx, unlike Egyptian sphinxes, is looking sideways over his shoulder, which is not something you would see in Egyptian art. He would once have had a tall headdress, which is now missing. Should be familiar to you now, Hathor and Amun, yet again. In this case, they are both on top of what would have been a cylindrical amulet case placed inside of a rock crystal case. In the case of Hathor's, it's a round ball. In the case of Amun, it's a fluted column. The cylinder is now missing from the Amun version. And I find these interesting because the rock crystal, going back to the time of Kerma, we see had a special significance for the Kerma people, possibly because it was found in veins, geological veins, along with gold. And this is something that we really don't find paralleled in Egyptian art. These cylinders probably held either a sacred material or a spell on papyrus or a gold leaf that was worn around the neck to bring these powers to the people wearing them. This very tiny amulet from another one of Pianki's queens shows the queen being nursed by the goddess Hathor and under the protection of a vulture goddess, and she's holding in her hand the sign of life. So by nursing her, Hathor is giving her eternal life. What is interesting here is that you'll notice that the queen, she's clearly a queen based on her headdress and the same kind of a fillet around her head that we saw on Taharka, but she's also of a different sort of physical type than the goddess Hathor. She's a bit more voluptuous, and as we move forward, we'll see that this is the feminine ideal of beauty in Nubia, unlike in Egypt. These types of images of Hathor nursing kings, a royalty, are paralleled in earlier times in Egypt, but in Egypt, it is universally kings that are shown in this position. And this indicates, to some extent, the significance of women in Nubia at this time. We know from royal inscriptions, which the Napatan kings were kind enough to write in Egyptian hieroglyphs so that we can read them, that queens and queen mothers played a significant role in the royal succession at this time. So this is yet another indication of the powerful role that women played in the Napatan period. Pianki's kings' wives and other royal women also had numerous of these large, when we say pectoral, I mean basically an amulet that is worn over your chest, of these large faience pectorals. These lasted only for about a generation. They probably all come from the same workshop, and they show a great deal of variation. One of the most common being these winged scarabs that promote solar imagery and protection. These are well paralleled in Egypt. Very commonly found in pairs in various different sizes are these two goddesses, both depicted nude. You again get that very voluptuous Nubian body type with downturned wings, protective cobras on their shoulders. Who they are, we don't know. The horns and sun disk on the human-headed goddess suggests an association with Hathor. The lion-headed goddess, also a solar disk. And those of you who maybe heard Solange Ashby's talk in this series earlier, she tells the story of when Hathor became enraged with humankind, fled to Nubia and threatened to kill everyone. She took the form of a lioness. So I think it's possible that these may represent, and I have to ask Solange about this, the friendly human Hathor and the dangerous lioness Hathor. But again, that's speculation. This sort of dangerous-looking little creature, Pataikos, is a protective deity who originated in Nubia. And we wouldn't really be able to say much of anything about him were it not for the fact that he was later adopted by the Egyptians and became one of the most popular protective gods, or not gods, demigods, really, in their pantheon. And he's wielding knives to protect women and children from harm. The flip side of the amulet, which you see here on the left, actually shows another one of these lion-headed goddesses. These are decorated on all sides. Now, here is a case where I am not even going to pretend to be able to explain what these gods are. It almost seems as if the jewelers that were making these objects decided to mash up images coming from all these different amulets and come up with something altogether new and different. So, for example, here on the left, we have that squat little body of Pataikos, the wings of the winged scarabs, the ram head of Amun, the sun disk on his head. And on the right is this very strange human body, but with two heads, the neck and back of which are the hoods of a cobra, and the face is of a hawk or a falcon. So if you have any ideas, do see me afterwards, because I would love any suggestions. In this case, a pectoral that was made to be sewn onto the mummy wrappings of a king, Amani Netaki Lebte. And you can tell that from the pierced tabs on the edges. And this is a very, very Egyptian-style object, showing the goddess Isis with her outstretched wings, and a beautiful repoussé technique where the image is pressed out from the back of a piece of gold foil and then incised. And this is one that's blissfully easy to understand the meaning, because if we read hieroglyphs, Egyptian hieroglyphs, they've basically explained who this is and what she's doing, because that object on top of her head is her name, Isis. And in her, on your right, her left hand, she's holding a sail from a boat, which is the Egyptian hieroglyph for breath or wind, and possibly familiar to some of you. In her other hand, she's holding the Ankh. So she is literally offering the king the breath of life to enable him to survive in the afterlife. This slightly earlier image shows a very similar looking deity, and actually has been published as a representation of Isis on this broad collar, this narrow collar of a queen. But if you look closely, this is not in fact a goddess. This is a male god who has a solar disk on his head, outstretched wings similar to Isis. This is not a god that is paralleled in Egypt. although the style is very much Egyptian. The circular shape of the collar itself might have solar connotations. So there seems to be, and on the back of it, which you can't really see, is a scarab beetle, which also has solar connotations. So this seems to be replete with solar imagery, although we don't know exactly who that god is. Now, if these objects were found out of context, not during an excavation, they're very, very large strings of beads and bead nets. And it might not be immediately clear who wore them. Was it a king or a queen or a noble? Or, well, it turns out it was a horse. At the site of El Kuru, Pianki and his successors buried teams of horses, and here you see their tombs as found. They had a special cemetery, 200 dedicated to them. And once the bones were removed, you can see lying here right in position as they fell off the horse's neck, some with original stringing, the horse jewelry, as it was. And this is what has enabled it to be restrung, as you see in the exhibition. Among the most enigmatic objects found in the Napatan royal tombs are these cylinders, and these are not jewelry, but they obviously were created in jewelers' workshops, beautifully decorated, technically extraordinary. Some of them are solid gold, some of them are gilded silver with enamel. They bear decorations of these very Egyptian-style winged goddesses, and I'm not going to say much of anything else about them, because not only are we not sure what they are, but because if you keep your eye on the Getty Village website, you may have an opportunity to hear about these in a great amount of detail later on. Given the objects with which they were found, I might propose that they had a cosmetic function, but scholars have written articles, debates about what their function is, and so hang on and keep your eye on the website, because maybe we can give you some more information about that later. There was no break in the ruling dynasty between the Napatan and Meroitic period. At some point, maybe about 600 BC, the capital moved farther south, and eventually the royal cemeteries, about 300 BC, followed, and they're buried in a series of 3 cemeteries, the kings and elite people, around the capital city of Meroe, which is just being excavated today. So here you see them during the excavations. When we look at representations of kings and ruling queens under the Meroitic period, we have not only ruling kings, but actual ruling queens. They're not married to the king, they are the king. And as you can see from one of these representations from a Meroitic tomb, they loved their jewelry. They are covered with, even the dog is wearing jewelry. Unfortunately, we don't have any jewelry, or not, we have jewelry from royal burials, but most of what we have is from non-royal burials of elite people. Virtually all of the royal tombs were robbed. In the last, a great group of jewelry was discovered in the 1820s by a man named Frugge. Smuggled it out of Egypt, and it's now in Berlin and Munich. And if he had just left it there, it would have been there for Reisner to find only a generation or so later, but oh well, we live with that. But what we do have is, as I say, some jewels from elite burials. And this is a type of bead which is very typical of Meroe. And we'll see several different examples of it in the exhibition. And what they did was they made multi-part repoussé representations of gods or other images, and then soldered them to a flat back. So these beads are hollow, and they're very fragile. They may have functioned primarily for burial, because they would have been in great risk of being squashed if you were wearing them in real life. But if you look closely, you'll see that the lower part of the beads shows a ram head of Amun, and at the top you see a woman, a female face, with a tall crown on her head. And that type of crown is associated with the goddess Mut, who is Amun's consort. So what we have is a composite representation here of Amun and his consort Mut. This is the cornelian beads are also very popular during Napatan period, when black, red, and white became significant colors in their jewelry repertoire. As Sarah mentioned, the Meroitic jewelers were masters at enameling, and they came up with at least 7 documented types of enamel, some of which had not been thought previously to have been invented until the Middle Ages in Europe. Don't want to give the Africans credit for that. So here we have just an earring on the left-hand side showing some of that enamel still in place. And as Sarah pointed out earlier, on the right we have this wonderful bracelet with the goddess Hathor, hopefully you recognize now, surrounded by a multicolored enamel surround. And she is still holding the sign of life. Hathor continues to appear in Meroitic jewelry, as does Amun. But we also have the introduction in the Meroitic period of new indigenous gods. It's now been quite a long time, centuries, since Egypt was independent of Greek and Roman rule. And the Meroitic people farther south begin to veer away from Egyptian iconography to a certain extent. And this goddess on the right is to date unidentified. She's a mixture of different elements that we may recognize. The tall crown that we just saw on Mut is on her head, but with a plume hanging down the back. She has wings that we have seen on previous goddesses, but a sort of a different style of wings. She is kneeling, and a number of new goddesses appear at this time in Meroitic art and iconography, but she doesn't exactly match any of them that I have been able to identify. So this is something I'm still sort of working on, is which of these goddesses she may represent. But clearly something very new in Meroitic. Signet rings were very, very popular in the Meroitic era, and they come in a silver and gold, and they were often found on burials, not only with one on every finger, but with multiple rings on each finger. And some of them, such as the two on the left here, continue to show imagery that is reminiscent of some of the ancient Egyptian material, such as this falcon-headed solar god on the far left, the vulture and cobra, the two goddesses of Upper and Lower Egypt in the center. But here on the right, we have a ring that has 4 lions' heads. And of course, we've seen some lion goddesses over time. But in the Napatan period, the Meroitic period, we have the emergence of a new god, a lion or lion-headed god named Apetamak, who becomes a rival of Amun in terms of importance within the Nubian pantheon. And I wonder if this lion might not represent Apetamak, and if Apetamak, in fact, might even be a reincarnation of those representatives of lions that we have thousands of years earlier at Kerma. It's always hard and dangerous to project thousands of years apart, but it's interesting, that sort of arc from Kerma back to Meroe. And finally, I'm going to show you 2 necklaces that I don't think have any hidden meaning at all. They're just beautiful necklaces that strike me for their workmanship and their craftsmanship. These look contemporary, like something you might find and wear today. I certainly would. If I could take one home with me, I would. And so I show these just to show you that sometimes jewelry is just jewelry. Thanks for listening. So we now have some time for questions. And we have microphones that are going around to the audience who are here in the room. If anybody has a question, they'll pass the microphone to you. And Sarah in the front will be taking questions from our online listeners. And just let me know. We will try to go back and forth and share. I see one hand right here.
You mentioned that this is most of the biggest collection you can see outside of Sudan. Is it possible to see a remainder part of these collections in Sudan or somewhere else?
Yes, it is. In fact, it's interesting because the way the division of finds worked, if there were identical objects, one would come to the Boston, the other went to the Sudan National Museum in Khartoum. So in some cases, we have one earring and they have the other earring. Or we have half of a necklace and they've got the other half of the necklace. And back in the 90s, there was a big exhibition that toured Europe where they brought a lot of these things together for the first time. The Sudan National Museum has not had most of the really precious material on display. for security reasons. And the museum is currently closed because it's doing a major and long-needed renovation. So when they reopen, it may be possible that a lot more of it will be on view. It was all sort of, much of it was kept like in a vault previously because the security was not that great at the museum. But I think with this new renovation, hopefully a lot more of it will be open for the public to see.
We also have some questions coming in on Zoom, so we'll try to sort of alternate between in-person and Zoom. One viewer is curious about the restringing of these beads for the necklaces, the bracelets, the belts. How many of these pieces were found with whatever material was used to string them together still intact, and how was it determined how to restring them and display them in more recent times?
In some cases, there were pieces of the original string attached, but in other cases, it was just based on the excavation photos that showed how they were arranged. Not in this exhibition, but there are also bead net coverings that were covering some of the royal mummies that were also able to be reconstructed based on the fact that they were still in position. And this is where having the excavation records is so important, because many, many pieces of Egyptian jewelry, and not that many museums have Nubian jewelry, but if they were not found in an archaeological context, they're just sort of strung the way that the person who strung them thought would look nice. They don't necessarily bear any resemblance to what they were actually worn like in antiquity. So it's basically based on and in some cases, preserved string, but mostly on the excavation photos that show how they were found. I've got a couple people up there.
I was struck by the smallness of the objects. Were they much smaller people than us?
It certainly strikes me that they must have been thin, because some of the bracelets and the necklaces would barely fit around your wrist. But I don't know that anyone has ever done an actual study of the remaining. Most of the human remains are now in England, not Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I don't know that anyone's ever actually done any kind of a study of relative size to people today. Them were quite tall, but they seem to have been tall and slender, at least the Kerma material. It's remarkable how, without magnifying devices, they were able to make these incredibly detailed, really small things. They must have had either people with really good eyesight or very young people working on them, because, I mean, some of these, there are some bracelets in the Meroitic period that are woven with gold wire that, I mean, the bracelets are not even 1/4 of an inch thick, and they have this elaborate gold wire. And to think that someone not only had to braid that wire, to actually make the wire in the first place is, I mean, I don't know, I imagine myself trying to do that, and it would be a pretty thing.
Okay, so one of the
questions.
Zoom questions has to do with the origins of some of these materials that they're using. You talked about the presence of gold and quartz in Nubia, but what other materials were locally available versus what were they having to import as raw materials to use in their jewelry making?
Yeah, the gold, the cornelian, the quartz are local. Everything needed to make the glaze and to make faience can be produced locally. But there are other stones, and this is something interesting about I find Nubian jewelry versus Egyptian jewelry, is that they seem to be really fascinated by finding interesting stones that they can exploit for their patterns. And for example, there's a little Meroitic amulet of the moon god Thoth, who is carved in blue chalcedony, which is only found in Turkey. So that came a very long way. And it was obviously chosen because of its color reflecting the moon at night. They also have lapis lazuli, which had to be imported from Afghanistan. They have marble that was probably come from the Mediterranean world. So they're really, and even the shells, some of them come from the Red Sea coast. So there's extensive trade networks. And ivory, there's both hippo ivory and elephant ivory. And while these animals were present farther north in Africa than they are today, things like elephant ivory would have been an import from farther south. Hippo ivory probably could have been, acquired locally, although not easily, given the hippos are not the most docile of creatures.
Most of the jewelry shown today had to do with life or like extending the person. But Nubia was a very war-torn empire at some parts in history. Do some of the pieces you found reflect that, like part in their history? You see more war-like pieces, jewelry?
There are certain pieces of jewelry. I mean, many of the Kerma burials included these beautiful ivory, gold, and bronze swords and daggers. And in the exhibition, we have a little miniature version of one of these that was, in fact, the size of a letter opener. But it was found in the tomb of a little boy who also had a great wealth of other material with him, and perhaps the son of one of these warriors. They also included not jewelry, but a lot of them bows and arrows, which they were always associated with archery in ancient Egyptian records. And in the Meroitic times, we have jewelry that they have thumb rings that were originally meant as a functional thumb rings to protect your thumb when you're pulling back the string on your bow, but they ultimately became sort of just a symbol of prestige and power worn just as jewelry. So there definitely are some military, and there's also these large ivory flies, which were worn in pairs generally, and often found with the same people that have the swords and daggers. And we probably wouldn't know what those meant were it not for the fact that later on the Egyptians adopted this practice of using similar objects as sort of medals for valor in the field in battle. So it's extrapolating back from the Egyptian use that it's thought that they were adopted from the Nubians and used for the same function. Got another online.
Yes, so on Zoom we have a question about how some of the earliest techniques for working with these materials to create items of jewelry would have developed. Is there any archaeological evidence pre-Kerma of any sort of similar techniques or ways of working with materials, or do we have a sense of how this developed at Kerma?
We do, earlier than Kerma, have evidence that the far earlier Nubians had a great mastery of working with fire and moderating temperatures of spectacular pottery. The faience and glazed quartz weren't really in use yet at that point, but we do have beads that are made of ivory, of semi-precious stones, of, in some cases, are Egyptian imports, but there's not really any workshops per se. There is from Kerma a workshop that was used for the production of those glazed quartz beads, and the excavators found in those workshops a lot of broken ones, which is why it's very clear that this process was not an easy one to develop, that they wasted a lot in the process of mastering it. But to this point, no jewelers' workshops have been found. Most of the Nubian cities, though, have not been excavated. It's mostly been cemeteries and temples. But just in recent years, there's been a lot more work done in the cities, and that's where hopefully we'll find, or not we, someone will find the actual living quarters and workman quarters that will help to give us a lot more evidence about what daily life was like.
I'm going to, before we go back to the audience here, I'm going to jump in with a follow-up question that you sort of already touched on, but someone else online was asking about how they would have controlled the kiln temperature to make things like faience or the glazed quartz, and how they would have been able to control the temperature, what sort of temperatures were necessary to make these materials?
The necessary temperatures were really high, 1,000-degree kind of range. And Suzanne might be better qualified to answer that because she's done a lot more analysis on the techniques of producing this. But exactly how they managed to maintain the temperature is not certain because there's no surviving workshops. Now, in Egyptian art, there are representations of these sort of dome-shaped kilns and people with, what do you call them? Yes, bellows, thank you, that are pumping air in to keep them a flame, but it makes sense that something similar would be used in Nubia, but there's no concrete evidence at this point.
Okay.
Nope, we've got a, sorry.
Okay, hi. I have a question in regarding that there's a lot of material trade that were recorded, but are ever like art history trades, like in terms of like exchanging of artists traveling to one place to another? And another second question I have is that during the Queen Hatshepsut time, she does do a lot of trade with pot. And I'm just curious in terms of how this jewelry can be any form of diplomacy or political power or political gameplay at all during that time between Egypt and also, South Sudan.
And because it's portable, jewelry obviously makes a relatively easy form of exchange. And we know that in the period when Nubia was under Egyptian control, there was a huge amount of gold moving north from the Nubia into Egypt. And during Pianki's reign, in his accounts of his defeat of Egypt, he describes the people he conquered offering him gold and silver and precious metals and jewelry and all manner of other valuable commodities, which he takes back to Nubia with him. For much of Kerma history, for example, we don't have any written records. So other than the fact that you find Egyptian objects in Nubia and Nubian objects in Egypt, it's tough to say exactly what the function of this exchange was at that point. And in the Kerma period, what is interesting is there seems to have been, in the northern part of Egypt during the height of Kerma, the people from what is now Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, Israel, took over the northern part of Egypt. And the Kerma people allied with them from the south, and they were kind of trying to put pressure. And just say the last 30 years or so, the capital city of the Hyksos who took over the north has been excavated. And it's really fascinating because, and this continues into the early part of the New Kingdom in the 18th dynasty, is there's evidence that you've got Minoans and Mycenaeans there, you've got Kerma people living up there in the north of Egypt. So these places are real melting pots of different communities from various parts of the world. So there's a lot more, I think, communication and interaction and sort of cosmopolitanism than anybody, say, 50 years ago would ever have guessed.
So it's more of a chance that it's beyond just material trade. It could be like skill and art history trade.
Oh, yes. And in fact, there's a lot of people who think that during certain periods, like after Pianki's conquest of Egypt, that they actually brought Egyptian artisans down to Nubia to work on some of the, for example, writing the inscriptions that are done in Egyptian language. You'd have to have someone who was conversant in the Egyptian language. And then the Napatan kings who ruled Egypt really portrayed themselves as sort of better educated than the Egyptians and more in tune with the Egyptians' distant past and sacred texts. And they revived a lot of these older lost inscriptions. So it seems like the priests were very closely connected with Egypt and Nubia, often throughout periods, even when they weren't one in charge of the other.
So we'll go to one more Zoom question. Several people online are curious about the horse burials from the Napatan period and wondered if you could say more about why these horses were so significant, what were they used for by the Napatan kings, and why were they considered so prized that they received their own wealthy burials?
Well, horses in the ancient world, in ancient Africa in general, were always prized because they had only arrived from Asia, a few, maybe 100 years ago. But the Nubians seem, based on records from Assyria, to have been raising and training horses even before they conquered Egypt. So it's a misconception that the horses they only got them back from when they conquered Egypt. But in his accounts of his conquest of Egypt, Pianki describes one of the Nimlat, one of the kings that he defeats, and he's been besieging the Egyptian capital or particularly that regional capital. And when they finally capitulate, the king takes him into the royal house and offers him the royal women, and he says no. But then he goes out to the stables and sees the starving horses, and he's so moved and outraged that the horses could be starving, notwithstanding the fact that he's been besieging them. But that's so he expresses his grave outrage about this, and he takes the horses and brings them back to Nubia. But they would have been extremely valuable as chariot horses, because it was sort of the military technology at its most advanced in that time period. So, and these horses are buried in groups of either 4 or 8. So it's likely that they're chariot teams. But the jewelry is totally not functional tack of any kind. It's clearly just jewelry which possibly has amuletic value for the afterlife. And some of the same objects used in the jewelry, the cowrie shells and these like faience pendant beads, are also found in the burials of people. So they're using sort of human type, and they're sort of half their heads. So there's sort of human type decoration for the horses as well.
In the ancient times, is the gold more expensive than now or less?
Tough to say, because they didn't have money. So it was based on what you could get for your gold. And for Nubia, we don't really have that, because it was relatively abundant. It was probably less expensive to the Nubians than, say, for the Egyptians, but it all would have been very strictly controlled by the kings and queens and the royal family. So it wouldn't have probably been possible for just your average person to go out and buy a piece of gold jewelry without some sort of connection coming from the government.
All right, so I think we have time to take one more question, and then for those of you who are here in person, we do have a small reception afterward in the auditorium lobby where you can continue discussing and have an opportunity to chat with Denise if your question didn't get addressed. But to sort of end on a larger note, some people are curious about the current state of archaeological work in Sudan. You mentioned that mostly tombs and temples have been excavated, but are there unexcavated cemeteries, or what do we believe is still yet to be discovered of ancient Nubia?
There is an enormous amount of work going on in Sudan right now. And people have moved away so much from the tomb and temple context, but and trying to do more with the domestic architecture. But there are probably more foreign missions working in Nubia, or in Sudan right now, than in Egypt, as well as the Sudanese. The National Corporation for Antiquities and Museums in Sudan, which is the overarching antiquity service, is very, very helpful to foreign missions, and they are teaming up with them. And of course, now they're using equipment that Reisner couldn't even have dreamt of, like drones and satellite imagery and ground-penetrating radar. And because most of the ancient towns are under modern towns or under, many feet of Nile silt that it's acquired from floods over the years, it takes things like this ground-penetrating radar to even know where to dig. So I think they're only scratching the surface. And the other thing that's been really exciting in recent years is, for a long, long time, the phase between when the Egyptians ceased to occupy or to control Nubia, and when the Napatan kingdoms emerged in the Jebel Barkal area, there was a big question as to what was going on. And a lot of interesting excavations at sites like Tombos with Stuart Tyson Smith, who's a local California, have been finding evidence of these sort of interesting hybrid settlements of where maybe some Egyptian people who married into Nubian families stayed behind, and you have graves where the wife is buried with completely Nubian accoutrements and the husband was Egyptian. So it's really sort of filling a gap in this, what was this sort of this question mark in the timeline. It now seems like we're starting to get a little bit more light on the pre-Napatan but post-Egyptian situation in northern Sudan. So I think and places like Kerma excavations, every season it seems like they find some more evidence of just what a huge, huge settlement it was and how closely interconnected with the rest of Africa it was. I mean, if you look, I think there's more to be found than Reisner has found.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Dr. Doxey.